This is Christopher Haley. I'm joined by Dr. John Crosby, who is the author of our new book, The Personalism of John Paul II, which we just released this week. The Hildebrand Project is devoted not only to promoting the work of Dietrich von Hildebrand, but personalism broadly. And no one besides Dietrich von Hildebrand has played such a vital role in the development of personalism and in our work than John Paul II, a truly great philosopher pope like no other. Monday, we celebrated his centenary. It's no exaggeration to say that today we are in danger of his teachings and his witness being forgotten, and his centenary could not come at a better time. This is the first of several events that we will devote to John Paul II throughout this year. I'd like to start with a personal story of my first encounter with JP2. I had just become a Christian, was in the process of becoming a Catholic when John Paul II died. I had studied about the papacy and the See of Peter and all of that, but I didn't really know anything about the current pope. His funeral was broadcast to parishes around the world. In Austin, where I was at the time, it was around 3 in the morning, if I recall. As that was just about when the bars were closing, I thought I would go check it out. I didn't imagine anyone would be there, but I was shocked when I entered the church and found it was packed like Easter Sunday at 3 in the morning with families and their children. And I was amazed. Who were these people? But more importantly, who was this man, John Paul II? Since then, I've been fortunate to meet a number of people who knew him personally and could call him a friend. One of those people is with us now, Dr. John Crosby. Before we get into the personalism of John Paul II, Dr. Crosby, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what he was like as a person.
Yes, thank you, Christopher. I do have some wonderful memories of him. And let me relate first a humorous one and then a more serious one. The humorous one was when my wife and I and baby John Henry, 4 years old, were present at the morning mass of Pope John Paul in his private chapel there in the Vatican. And toward the end of the mass, when the Pope was giving the final blessing, little John Henry cried out, "When is this going to be over?" Now, it was a very small chapel, and everyone in the chapel heard it, and John Paul heard it. And my wife and I thought, oh my, the Swiss guards are going to come and escort us out after such a disruption of the papal mass. But in fact, John Paul looked over to John Henry, not reproachfully at all, but with a kind of fatherly kindness, and also with a certain mischievous look in his eye, as if to say, now, I used to be a little boy like you. I understand. You've had enough. And the good news is that this mass is almost over. But the way John Paul spoke with his eyes, and with such fatherly gentleness to John Henry, and not without a certain kind humor. That was an unforgettable remembrance of him. Now, the other remembrance I wanted to share with you is of a different and more serious nature. It also concerns that morning mass in the private chapel of John Paul. He would, after communion and after mass was over, spend 15 or 20 minutes in prayer. And this prayer of John Paul's after communion is something unforgettable. George Weigel has described it very correctly. But John Paul seemed to be somehow, in a deep way, groaning in the spirit. You could almost imagine that he was somehow wrestling with God. It was a very physical kind of prayer that completely consumed him. And that image of the Pope in prayer, but caught up in prayer that was obviously for him a deep encounter with Jesus, So that you got the impression of an intense inner life and of a very strong personal encounter with the Lord. Nothing mystical or extraordinary, but simply a spiritual depth and intensity that was somehow awe-inspiring to those of us who got a glimpse of it. This is what's behind his reputation as a mystic, that he had this kind of inner life and this kind of intimacy with the Lord. All of us who were with him there at the end of those masses could feel it and were deeply moved by it. So those are just some recollections of the great John Paul, and we could go on in this vein, but I think our purpose, Christopher, if I recall my marching orders from you, is to discuss this little booklet that the Hildebrand Project has produced entitled The Personalism of John Paul II.
Yes, well, thank you. I always enjoy hearing the stories, and there are always more of them, it seems. So to begin with the book, which for starters, again, here it is, we don't even have our real copies yet. We still have our proof copies because of the pandemic is affecting shipping, but it is available now, right now. You can order yours on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever. So the book is The Personalism of John Paul II, and we should probably start with the notion of the person and the person as subject. I think many people today do not see any essential difference between humans and the rest of nature. We are things like other things. However, you say that we are not things like other things. We are not simply there, like plants or stones are simply there, but that man belongs to himself. What does that mean? That man belongs to himself, and what does that entail about our relationship to the natural world?
Yes, well, the idea is that every person, according to John Paul, is, as he says, a subject and not merely an object. So that language of subject and object is fundamental to his personalism. And the idea is that objects or things are there, whereas a person is not just there, but is present to himself, in possession of himself, existing in a fundamental condition of belonging to him or herself. So that, for John Paul, that marks a radical difference to all those plants and even animals and things in creation that lack this inner life, this interiority or self-presence. And of course, very much tied up to the self-presence is the power of self-determination that John Paul sees and ascribes to the human person. We aren't just acted on, as he says, by forces outside of ourselves, but we act through ourselves. And in that, we show ourselves as subject. Subject meaning a being who can say I, and is not just an object which is acted on from the outside. So that is, for John Paul, I think the beginning of the beginning, this subjectivity of the person, which simply means being a subject, being a self-present being, not a thing or an object. Where would you like to take it from there, Christopher?
Let me ask, we actually have a question in the Q&A, which is a common objection, I think, to this. I think you address it also in the book. Many people would say that man, first of all, belongs to God, not to himself. What would John Paul say to this?
Yes, well, he would say, of course, man belongs to God, but let's say as creature, man belongs to God, but as person, he belongs to himself. So there's a kind of natural tension of being our own, belonging to ourselves, and being not our own, belonging to another, belonging to God. And so, we would exaggerate the autonomy of the person. If we just stopped when we said each person belongs to himself and is his own, we have to add this belonging to God, but it's a belonging to God that is different, say, from the belonging of plants and animals to God. There's an independence there in the human person who belongs to God, which sets up a dialogue between God and man that is unlike anything else in creation.
So you mentioned subjectivity, the word subject, the distinction there between subject and object. I think these are popular topics that come up a lot. And when dealing with JP2, I think a lot of people just immediately have a knee-jerk reaction to anything having to do with subjects or subjectivity as bad, right? That means relativity. That means no objective, absolute truth. Can you clarify? Are we missing something here?
Yeah, one has to distinguish, and John Paul distinguishes with great care between subjectivity, that is being a person present to oneself, and subjectivism, which is the philosophy which says there is no objective reality. All of reality dissolves simply into our experiencing of it. Things are simply what we experience them to be. They have no substance of their own. Now, John Paul is as far away as possible from that kind of subjectivism. Everybody knows how he taught about moral issues with great clarity, and often stands up against what his successor, Pope Benedict, called the dictatorship of relativism. So the subjectivity, which is so important to John Paul and his personalism, has nothing to do with subjectivism, with a kind of dissolution of reality into the experiencing of person. So it's quite coherent when he says, yes, there's an objective moral law, a moral order of the world. This is a crime, that is a crime. And at the same time, appeals to us as persons who are defined by this interiority or subjectivity. Maybe that's helpful to think that a good alternate expression for subjectivity is interiority.
So that's another term you mentioned in the book, interiority, and also embodiment, which follows right after that. I want to build on what you were saying about the applicability to the moral law, but particularly how, as you say, that subjectivity and John Paul's understanding of embodiment actually help us to understand aspects of the moral law, as opposed to relativizing them. In some way, they illuminate them.
Yes. Well, you have in John Paul, in his personalist ethics, this idea that the primordial moral norm is that persons should always be respected as their own being, and never treated as a mere instrumental means or as a mere commodity for use or ownership, or as a mere part of a larger whole. So that is quite fundamental to John Paul. Do you go ahead and follow up, Christopher, with that?
Yeah, well, some of the examples you mentioned in the book are the way that his understanding of embodiment illuminates the encyclical Humanae Vitae, and the controversies around marriage and in vitro fertilization. And I believe you mentioned also contraception as well. So I think a lot of people would think a more subjectivist approach would make it easier perhaps even to relativize these things, but you say that's not the case. So and I guess I'm trying to get to a question I think a lot of people have is, okay, so maybe all this stuff about subjectivity isn't so bad, but what do we need it for? Aren't we fine without it? So is there something that it particularly is additive to these discussions that we're having today.
Yeah. Well,
Always.
for instance, let's go back to John Paul's encyclical on human work from 1981, one of the first encyclicals. And there he draws a distinction between the objective and the subjective aspects of human work. So the objective aspect is the thing produced by work. And the subjective aspect is the formation of the worker, what gets formed in the interiority of the worker through his or her work. You see, and it's a very original approach in that encyclical that he devotes a lot of attention to the subjectivity or interiority of the worker. And that leads him to think new thoughts about what it takes to show respect for workers and to organize a society in such a way that workers are honored as persons, that is, beings with an inner life. So that would just be one example. There are many other examples of that. So for instance, take the thing of in vitro fertilization. John Paul thinks that it's the whole procedure of, I'm assuming that all of my audience is aware of what's meant by that procedure, but he says it in effect a kind of manufacture of a new human person. It's an assembly and making of a person. And that's not right. Persons shouldn't be manufactured by other persons. Persons should rather be generated, born of the love between a man and woman. But to have, the biological material gathered in a lab and brought together by a lab technician, that mode of producing a person, John Paul says, is unworthy of a person. It objectifies, it commodifies, it doesn't honor this interiority of each person.
It reminds me of a line from C.S. Lewis where he is talking about modern science and says that the scientists today says Goethe would not have done to a turnip what we do without thinking to humans.
Yes, right.
This Baconian project, right, of
right.
mastering nature, right, put her on the rack and extract her secrets, and making man also a part of that. So right. I think it's probably fair to say that this view of science is not only inadequate when it comes to man, but also perhaps when it comes to nature.
Right. And let's go back to the theme of embodiment, which you raised. John Paul sees the danger that this idea of creation just being a lot of raw materials for our use, that idea getting extended to our relation to the body, as if our body were just something merely physical, available to any manipulation that we want, any manufacture or remanufacture that we want. And one of the deepest insights of John Paul is that we exist as embodied persons. We don't have a kind of inner spiritual personhood over here and a purely physical bodily character over here. Rather, we exist as embodied persons. And therefore, the body participates in the mystery of each person, participates in the interiority of persons. And therefore, the using of raw materials, that approach, which is fine, I suppose, in some settings, becomes violence against persons when transferred over to our way of relating to human persons.
And that would violate the personalist norm, right? Because persons should never be used as ends and should instead be the objects of respect and love, he says, right? So
one could say as well, persons should never be used, treated as mere objects, but always honored as subjects. Or never be treated as the extension of another, but always honored as a being of their own. These are variations on the personalist theme of John Paul.
That informs what you were saying also about work and employment, and I think these are common objections to, if you want to subscribe to a sort of personalism, it just seems like, well, everything violates it, right? I mean, how do you employ a person? But there are ways to do this that do honor the dignity of the person. And just because I've mentioned it a couple times, and before we get too far along, let's not assume that everyone who's joining us here, which, by the way, thank you for joining us, is familiar with the personalist norm, as John Paul articulates it. So which is a very fundamental idea from, I guess, first articulated in Love and Responsibility, or at least articulated there. And can you state what that is and why it's important?
Yeah. Well, it's somehow, for John Paul, foundational. It comprises almost all other moral norms, and sums them up. I think one way of thinking about the originality of John Paul is to see how he takes this personalist norm. Persons are never rightly used as a mere instrumental means, never rightly bought and sold as a commodity, but must always be honored as something in their own right, and uses that personalist norm to throw new light on traditional issues. So, for instance, in the whole teaching on marriage, you've got an old idea that one of the goals of the marital act is the relief of concupiscence. And John Paul comes along and says, wait a minute, if that involves the spouses simply using each other for sexual relief, that's out of order. You can't make any good personalist sense out of that. The idea that, well, the marital act is really justified only by the procreation, and therefore ought to be pursued somehow as instrumental with a view to procreation. And John Paul says, no, that too doesn't make any personalist sense. The spouses can't be using each other for the sake of offspring. They have to love each other for their own sakes, and then the offspring, of course, that they have to remain open to that, and that's a kind of superabundant blessing that arises. But so he ruffled a lot of feathers by the way he critiqued the old idea of relief of concupiscence, or critiqued the idea of an exclusive instrumentalization of the marital act for offspring. And that's his personalist philosophy, bearing good fruit, I would say.
I wonder if you can elaborate on that. That was before my time, but one reads about these controversies, and that certainly was not well received by everyone, right? I mean, essentially, to put a point on it, he said that you can commit adultery within marriage with your spouse.
Right, exactly, because you can violate the personalist norm within marriage. Though this other person is someone to whom you're married, you can still, in various objectionable ways, be using him or her.
How did that go over when he said that?
Well, the original.
Were you around? I mean, where?
Oh yes, the original address. This was all in the Theology of the Body. Those addresses given between about 79 and 83. So I think that was in 81 when he made the statement that it is possible for, he says, for the lust condemned by Christ to be present in marriage. That created a firestorm in our sexualized world. Who can understand that? But if you want to understand it, you have only to go to the personalist principle, and then it makes a great deal of sense.
So I think it sounds like at least what happened in that case and many other cases with controversies involving these proclamations and statements by JP2 is that people fail. We'll assume, not by any fault of their own, but fail to understand his personalist principles, or they might think that it's something other than it is. So we've articulated what is the personalist norm. I'd like for everyone on the call to also help guard against some of the misunderstandings of
Yeah.
personalism. So if it is it fair to say, as I gather from your book, that maybe on the two false extremes would be, on the one hand, an individualism, and on the other hand,
Yeah.
a sort of spiritualism.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And that people frequently fall into, or think personalism might be reduced to. Can you elaborate on those a little bit and
all right, let's take the
tell us how it's
individualism.
not?
Let's take the individualism first. So by individualism, he means an exaggerated stress on one's individual autonomy, a stress on asserting one's rights, of relating to others, mainly to keep them from intruding into one's rights. So that kind of individualistic mentality has nothing to do with his personalism. Now, it may sound at first like it does, because he says of the person, each person is his own and not belongs to himself. And so that might seem to be setting up the individualism. But John Paul has this beautiful teaching on the capacity of persons for self-gift. So persons are capable of giving themselves to another just because they belong to themselves. So the belonging to oneself doesn't play out in an individualistic vein, isolating persons from each other, but it sets persons up for this self-donation, this giving of oneself, this making oneself, even in the case of marriage, belong one to another. And he wants to say this is part of the real vocation of persons, not only to exist in self-possession, but to live out of that self-possession so as to give themselves to others, or even make themselves belong in a certain way to others. So, so individualism, that's utterly foreign. There's a deep, deep sense of the I-thou relation, the profound connectedness of persons, persons ordered one to another, destined to live and die one for another. That's part of John Paul's personalism. And if you read it rightly, you see that those things that look like individualism really lay the foundation for understanding that self-gift. So that's the one. Now you mentioned the spiritualism. Yeah, that's a great danger of personalism, to take, especially when you stress interiority. All right, we've got this interior spiritual being, and then we've got these arms and legs and skin and body, and so they seem to be, completely incommensurable with each other. And so as against that breaking apart the human person into a merely physical body and a purely spiritual interior life, John Paul conceives, as I said a little bit before, of each person as being embodied. There is a mysterious fusion almost of the human person in the body, so that we exist as embodied persons. Something that is ratified in an interesting way in the Christian belief that we have bodies not only in this life, but in the next too. We believe in the resurrection of the body, so that we are embodied from now on, and not just temporarily while on earth. So we are embodied in a way that forbids us to break the human person into two pieces. And this is why respect for the body and respect for human sexuality becomes such a delicate thing, because it's not merely physical. It's the body of a person, the face of a person.
Thank you. I hope that's helpful. I'm reading some of the questions also while we're chatting here.
Yes, I see an array of.
And thank you for everyone who's submitting them. We will get to as many of these as we can as we wrap up here. But one that just came in, I think worth clarifying as we're talking about embodiment and how personalism is not individualism or spiritualism, is to clarify also the notion of interiority. Which is another of these core concepts that again distinguishes us from the Stones. And you talked a moment ago in when you were talking about self-gift, about acting out of ourselves, and again this notion of being the I who acts, right, as he talks about it in the acting person. And so what is distinctive about this notion of interiority?
Well, it as I say, it is, I think, practically equivalent to subjectivity in John Paul. So if you want to talk about subjectivity and avoid the suspicion of subjectivism, talk instead about interiority, and you will be right on track. There's a famous essay of John Paul. When people ask me, how do I get into his philosophy? I know it's very difficult. I always send them to this. It's about a 8 or 9 page essay called Subjectivity and the Irreducible in Man, a profound, seminal essay that gives you the vision of his personalism in just a few pages. And there too, subjectivity means interiority, and he wants to say, you'll never find the person, you'll never understand the human person if you look at them from without. You have to find a way of understanding the human person from within in terms of his or her interiority. That's what really reveals man as person, he wants to say. And so he's got that distinction, if I may bring in some philosophical terminology in that essay, between what he calls the cosmological vision of the person and the personalist vision. And the cosmological is more a view of man from without, looking at the human being as one of many kinds of creatures in creation. The personalist view arises when you enter into the subjectivity or interiority of the person. That's where the whole mystery of personhood presents itself.
Do you think it is, I'm glad you mentioned the cosmological perspective. Yeah. I was hoping we would actually get to talk about that. First, so you mentioned in the book that this was the perspective of Aristotle and the classics, was to view man as one other type of animal among other types of animal, one type of natural thing among other natural things. And you say that one of the dangers of this is that it tends to reduce man to the world, sort of flatten, if I may, man into the rest of the world. Do you think that this is what people think today? I mean, it seems to me that maybe not in a very articulate way, but I think a lot of people have a cosmological view of man, and both, and not just in the secular world. I mean, I think perhaps this happens also in the church. I'd be curious your thoughts on just what is the danger? Why does the cosmological perspective tend to reduce man to the world? Well, what's the danger there that John Paul helped us avoid?
Well, first off, one has to underline the fact that John Paul thinks the cosmological perspective, that is, this view of the human being from the outside, has its truth. We are, after all, beings with an objective aspect and an external aspect. And there's something that can be learned about who we are looking at us from the outside. He just wants to say that if you want to get into and do justice to the mystery of each man as person, you've got to go beyond that view from without. You've got to enter into, sometimes philosophers today like to say, you've got to get beyond a third person perspective where you take others as she or he or they, them, and enter into this first person perspective, which lies in when one says I, and the subjectivity of the other opens up. So they're both legitimate aspects, but there's, for Wojtyła, the danger that the cosmological, which is so obvious at first, somehow predominates and interferes with an exploration of the interiority of persons. So, for instance, you'll never get very far in exploring the free will, the freedom of persons, if you just look from the outside. You'll always find behavior, looking at human beings from the outside, behavior that has its causes. To really get into the mystery of personal freedom, one has to find a way into the interiority of persons. That's where the real evidence for free will is to be found. We'll never get beyond some kind of weak or soft determinism with the cosmological perspective.
Is it this same interiority and this free will that allows us to make, as you said earlier, a gift of ourselves? I think that's a hard term for people, the self-gift.
Yes.
That's one of those, those terms you get used to because you read it a lot.
Yeah.
And we all seem to just use this freely. But then when I talk to someone who has never been around this sort of philosophy, what on earth could that possibly mean, right? I give myself, but here I am. I still have myself.
Yes,
so
right. Exactly.
What have I given?
Right. Right. So when you give money away, you don't have it anymore.
Yeah. But,
when you give yourself away, you, in a way, have yourself more authentically than before you had given yourself away. So John Paul is very fascinated by that paradox, that there's a kind of self-gift that isn't a spending down of oneself, but a flourishing of oneself. So things that make no sense on the physical or cosmological plane are the norm on the personalist plane. So, so Christopher, you're a newly married man. You know what that means, to say that you give yourself to your wife and in a way want to belong to her and be not just exclusively your own anymore, but hers as well. And so that's John Paul's self-gift right there. Everybody knows it somehow from experience. And a lot of people know it through its absence. When people live that self-centered individualism and autonomy and refuse any vulnerability or dependency on others, then they wither, because as persons they have this vocation to self-gift.
Yeah. So it's maybe not some deeply mysterious thing. It's often lived out in daily life and in little things. Exactly. And you mentioned marriage, and that's often the first thing that comes to mind. People ask, what's so different about being married? What have you learned? And I said, golly, I was just so selfish in ways that had never occurred to me, and that weren't necessarily bad in the sense that I was trying to take to myself or appropriate things that weren't mine, but just that I went through life not thinking of someone else, right? I ate whatever was in the fridge. I didn't think that somebody else might need food in the morning, because there wasn't someone else. Just little things like this where you realize that myself was just my own, and now I can and try at least to give that to others, and so it's lived out in these little ways also, and it's not just this grand, deep self-gift that I think it sometimes sounds like people don't know what that could be.
It can be lived out in very plain, everyday, humble ways. This self-gift, in the sense. But humble as it may be, there's still something big going on there. If a person in possession of himself finds a way to give himself away.
I think it's heroically virtuous every time I don't eat the rest of the brisket. So I absolutely think it's a big deal. But it isn't nonetheless a big deal in many small ways. I see our questions are piling up, and many
see,
of them are
I
very
see
good.
an incredible number of interesting questions.
Yeah, so we're going to try and get to some of
going
these
over the screen here.
And, you know, 'cause I still have some more, but I'm not going to assume that mine are any more interesting than all of these. So I'm going to, you know, forgive me if I miss a question. I'm kind of having to go through them quickly here. But
yeah.
So we've been talking about, you know, what he was, and John Paul II's particular personalism. But that's not the only personalism. There are other personalisms out there. Can you say what would distinguish John Paul's particular personalism from others, or does he have perhaps any very close allies in this? And Hildebrand, Stein, Shaler, Marcel.
Yes.
What's particular about John Paul?
Yeah. He, well, of course, he, you know, has this philosophical formation in Thomistic philosophy. And that goes hand in hand with a formation in this phenomenological personalism. Those would count perhaps as the two great formative influences on John Paul. And so that imparts a distinctive character to his personalism. It keeps his personalism embedded in the great tradition of Western Christian philosophy. So that it distinguishes it from other forms of personalism that incline to the individualism or to the overly spiritual view of the human person. His is more integrated, thanks to that strong connection that he has with the great Judeo-Christian philosophical tradition.
Great. That leads me into a couple other questions I'm going to try to combine. So John Paul II was a professor of philosophy and also a priest. And so how does he understand the relation between faith and reason as sources of knowledge? You mentioned you speak on that in the beginning of your book, and then a very pointed question: is his personalism understandable without faith or theology? So you mentioned, and I keep making the question bigger, but add a line from your book in which you say that only Jews and Christians have the spiritual resources to acknowledge unconditional worth in all human persons. So can you tell us about the relationship between faith and personalism?
Yes. All right. Well, it was very intent in my little book to underline the fact that this personalism of John Paul's is in large part a philosophical position. I'm pushing back against the view that is so widespread and which we're all somehow infected by, namely that there's really only two ways to know about the human person. We can know what science, natural science tells us, biology and neuroscience, or we can know by faith. And the idea that there are only those two ways of getting at the human person, either the natural scientific way or the way of faith, is a big mistake. And certainly John Paul completely rejects it. This whole reflection on the human person and formulating the personalist principle, that's all a work of John Paul as philosopher. And so it's one needs to do justice, and he wants to recover. In fact, he, having studied philosophy so deeply and had been such an original philosopher himself, often worked as Pope to recover some sense of the power of human reason. In fact, one of his most important encyclicals is called Faith and Reason, where he reflects on this, and uses the beautiful image of a bird with two wings. We fly with the two wings of faith and reason. And to fly only with reason alone, that's to be an amputated bird who is not going to get very far. So he was profoundly convinced that philosophy had to be recovered as a mode of knowing all its own, irreducible to that of the natural sciences, irreducible to the way of faith. And
why did it have to be recovered? You say
Yeah,
in the book that even
yeah.
philosophers today despair of philosophy,
right,
despair of its ability to
yeah,
help us find objective truth, moral norms.
right.
Why? From what are we recovering it?
Well, there is a certain despair of truth and a sense, especially after these powerful thinkers who have tried to debunk the human capacity for knowledge and truth, like Hume and Kant and Nietzsche. Their influence has been immense, and it has been in the direction of discrediting philosophy. And John Paul is aware of what kind of situation he inherits, and therefore quite consciously pushes back against that despair of philosophy achieving anything.
And back to this philosophy as another way between science and faith. If faith is one way and science is another, but then we want to say that, well, philosophy is this alternative, but only Christians and Jews can really be personalists. Aren't we still kind of saying that it's faith or science, and that this other way isn't accessible to you without faith? Right.
It's
so
perhaps you've perhaps caught me there in a sentence that's a little bit overstated, Christopher. Let me back up and say express myself a little more cautiously and say that Jews and Christians can understand in a particular way the dignity of persons, because human beings are known by God. They're called into being one by God. For us Christians, redeemed by the God-man. And so that implies a tremendous worth and dignity to the human person. And I don't think you can gather any such sense of worth or dignity without recourse to revelation. So let's just say that the sense of the dignity of the person is at its highest pitch in the framework of Christian revelation. But it can't be denied that even philosophers who don't share the Christian faith can understand significant things about the person. Certainly, you don't have to be any kind of believer to see that persons ought never be used as a mere instrumental means. So that elementary point of departure in John Paul's personalism is available to all thinkers of goodwill, not just Christians. You might say the horror of using persons and commodifying persons is it's never so clear as in the setting of Christian revelation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think for a lot of people, myself included, it's that the insight even that pushes you towards the Christian faith and this understanding of because there is this insight that people are more than the world says that they are, or than whatever set of ideas that I presently have say that they are. I am more than that, right? And this people rebel against that and look for a greater understanding. We have a few different questions swirling around a topic. I'll try and sort of combine them into a broad one to say, what is the relationship between John Paul II's philosophy and that of St. Thomas Aquinas? What is Thomistic personalism? Is he a Thomistic personalist? Are these things
Right.
compatible, antagonistic? Tell
Yes,
us
right.
more.
All right. Well, he's certainly indebted to the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas in many ways. And he doesn't think of his personalism as antagonistic to that Thomistic heritage, and hence the label Thomistic personalism is a label he's quite willing to apply to himself. So what is perhaps distinctive vis-a-vis the Thomist tradition is the stress on subjectivity, on interiority. So when he writes in the essay on subjectivity and the irreducible in man, he's pushing back a little bit against his own Thomistic tradition. And so he, therein lie, but many Thomists, not just John Paul, but others too, think that this is like the Jesuit philosopher Norris Clarke thought that this is the whole future of Thomism, to take more seriously the subjectivity of the person and become a personalist Thomism. So it's not, at least in the view of Norris Clarke or of John Paul, this is not a foreign body. This is not something that subverts and poisons Thomism, but it adds something that, as you might say, been underdeveloped, and which makes for an enrichment of it. You probably wanted to provoke me into something more controversial than that.
No, I didn't.
But I'm going to take that
I'm sure others
conciliatory
would,
line.
I am personally curious. Does John Paul use that phrase, Thomistic personalism? At any point, does he apply that to himself?
Yeah, he does. He, in the collection of papers called, published under the title Person and Community, there's one entitled Thomistic Personalism.
And he says of that, that's me. I'm one of those guys.
Yes, he identifies.
Okay, great. Well, I think we've settled that once and for all.
Yes. But there are Thomists and Thomists, and something that this is this focus on subjectivity is more dangerous than fruitful. But in any case, John Paul didn't think that.
So I want to talk a little bit about his legacy, given that we are celebrating the centenary. What has happened since his death? Have people been picking up his philosophy, developing it, applying it in some ways, or not? Are there philosophers today whom we could point to say that this is very much in the vein and the spirit of John Paul?
I think maybe John Paul's probably not a presence like he was when he was alive, and maybe in some quarters the memory of him is growing weak, but there are philosophers who, not just myself, my own work has been tremendously inspired and enriched by the encounter with his personalism. But there's my friend Juan Manuel Burgos in Spain, who builds on Wojtyła's personalism and has written important studies of Wojtyła. There are, here at Franciscan University, there are several of us who are profoundly committed to this personalism of John Paul and are transmitting it wherever we can in our courses. So
it's okay if you mention the Hildebrand Project here too.
Yes, and of course the Hildebrand Project is a great agent there in keeping alive the memory of John Paul, and especially the rich philosophical legacy of the man.
Well, I hope that's a helpful start for some people, and also again this book, which I got to say, it really is a great introduction to John Paul's personalism. I don't know of anything else that's this accessible, that covers so much, and I think anybody can read it. As you say in the book, people are intimidated often by philosophy, but instead of explaining it, you're just going to do it. And people read along with it and find that they can philosophize just fine. So also on the question of legacy, we have a question here. What lasting effects has John Paul II's personalism had on the church, and what remains to be done by the church, both ministerial and lay, I guess, in terms of applying that personalism?
Yeah, well, certainly a lasting impact can be discerned in his theology of the body. That famous 4-year catechesis, cast in the form of a commentary on Genesis and other scriptures, that has found a tremendous reception in the church, and that's maybe the part of his personalism that's best known in the Catholic world and is alive. I should have mentioned that too, where you ask what's living there in the John Paul legacy. Certainly the theology of the body and the attempt to develop it, but also to pitch it in a way that lets it reach a broad public. That's but there's certainly more to be done. I think far more can be done on the whole embodiment of persons, the danger of the spiritualistic image of the person, the kind of dualism of person and body, and also the another very intriguing area. It has to do with the whole domain of solidarity. That was not only the name of the Polish workers' movement that led to the downfall of communism, but also the name of a fundamental issue in John Paul's personalism. And so he has a very profound understanding of a kind of co-responsibility in which we all live. It's close to the famous Dostoevskian idea of the responsibility of each for all. And so that sense that, when we do wrong, we don't just, remain in solitude with the wrong we've done, but a kind of poison is disseminated through the human world, affecting beyond anything we can track or count all other persons. So that solidarity of persons, which was a great theme in the work of Max Scheler, the phenomenologist to whom he was very indebted. That solidarity, it's deep there in John Paul, but a great deal could be done to develop it further, articulate it further, protect it against misunderstandings. In the year 2000, there was this, John Paul did this, led the church in this self-examination over the past millennium. He wanted to go into the new millennium only after seeing everything sinful that had been in the church for the past millennium and to repent of it. And his idea was that we belong so much, we exist in such a profound solidarity with one another, that we all have some co-responsibility for the darkness, the dark sides, the sinful sides in the church. And we all need to be involved in this collective ecclesial repentance. It was an inspired thing that he did to, as head of the church, humble himself before the Lord of history, acknowledging all the darkness, the anti-Semitism, the degradation of women, all kinds of wrong done in the name of the church. And he felt that we're so connected together. So this is John Paul opposed to individualism. that it takes a certain collective repentance to free ourselves from this burden of the centuries. And so on that first Sunday in Advent in the year 2000, there was a solemn, extraordinary penance service in St. Peter's, where the Pope went through different categories of sin, repenting for each. That doesn't make any sense from an individualist point of view. The individualist will say, well, I didn't have anything to do with the anti-Semitism of earlier centuries. John Paul goes deeper with this sense of solidarity. And so I haven't forgotten your question, Christopher. What work can be done and should be done? I think to unpack the depth and richness of his thought, his Dostoevskian thought on solidarity would be one direction.
Okay, well, everyone on the call, you have your marching orders. And we're just crossing an hour here, so I want to start wrapping up. I want to get back to this, to the notion of personalism, which is again the theme of the book here, and it ends with an essay called "What is Personalism," which is an extremely helpful essay to answer that question. In it, you say that that it is the awakening of human beings to personal existence is an epical event, a sea change in the way we understand ourselves. There are many people who would say that they're not personalists, or they are against personalism for whatever sort of reason. And but here you say it as an epical event, to sea change. It would seem that you were saying we can't go back. Like, we've made this fundamental change, and that we now see ourselves. We understand ourselves as living our personal existence with interiority. Is this a moment like? I can't help but think of Kant's essay on what is enlightenment and his Copernican revolution and the turn to the subject. We also had a question about this as well, about the turn to the subject in the moderns. Is this personalism a similar sort of turn in philosophy from which we cannot return?
Yeah, you could say there's a certain turn to the subject that begins in a particular way with Descartes, and seems to be a theme of modern philosophy. And so some friends of Wojtyła may be a little troubled by the fact that the turn to the subject seems to have worked out rather badly with philosophers like Kant. And here we find a turn to the subject in Wojtyła. But one has to stress that the turn to the subject in Wojtyła is a turn to the person. It is a turn to the inner life, the interiority, this mystery of the person before God. So in a sense, Wojtyła is a modern philosopher. He somehow participates in this turn to the subject, but it seems to me he takes the poison out of it, that is, takes the subjectivism out of it, by the personalist conception he has of the subject.
I hope that is helpful to everyone in clearing that up. It's actually very helpful to me. We have lots more questions, but I feel like we might be taxing you to keep asking them.
I see the questions going across the screen. I wish we could do justice to all of them.
I know, and some of them are really great, huge, potentially controversial questions, which would be a lot of fun. So we may just have to do this again, or any of you who have unanswered questions, you might want to apply for one of our future events or for our seminar. We'll be announcing an update to that very soon, our virtual summer seminar on the heart, which will deal with a lot of these topics. If you aren't, subscribed to, our email list and our social media, you'll hear all kinds of, things about this throughout the year. I can't recommend this book highly enough, not just because we published it. It's actually really great. Any concluding thoughts, John?
Well, I want to thank everybody for listening in. I saw the roster of almost 200 names and saw a lot of friends and former students there. And I wish I could connect individually with each of you, but I thank you for making this happen. And I very regret that I can't respond to each question. There's a lot that you've submitted in the questions.
Yeah, well, this is our first time doing something like this, and so seeing the, I think, overwhelmingly positive response and interest is very encouraging. And if we can convince Dr. Crosby to do it again, I'm sure that we will, and hopefully have some more of these. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. This has been very enjoyable. I hope that you enjoy the book. This video will be on our YouTube channel very shortly. So if you missed some of it or want to share it with your friends, please feel free to do so. We encourage it, and we look forward to seeing you next time and meeting you in person. So,
Yeah.
all right. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Christopher. And thank you, everyone in the audience.